The ledger blurred before Mateo Alvarez's eyes, the neat columns of figures dissolving into the suffocating heat of the Seville afternoon. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of sunlight piercing the gloom of the merchant house office, each spark a tiny agony against his frayed nerves. He wasn't here, not truly. He was leagues away, on a windswept coast near Cadiz, the salt tang sharp in his nostrils, the sound of the waves a restless counterpoint to a girl's laughter. Isabella. The name was a physical ache behind his ribs, a constant, low thrumming that had stolen his appetite, his sleep, his very substance these past months. He gripped the edge of the heavy oak desk, his knuckles white. How could a memory have such weight, such power to unmoor him? He, Mateo Alvarez, second son, destined for the respectable grind of commerce, reduced to this hollow-eyed wraith by the absence of a village girl he'd known only one transformative summer. The scent of orange blossoms drifting from the courtyard below, usually a balm, now felt like a mockery. It was the scent of Seville, of duty, of the life laid out for him, a life that felt utterly alien since Isabella Moreno had imprinted herself onto his soul. He traced the faded lines on an old map lying beneath the ledger, a chart of the very coast where he'd met her while assisting his uncle. His fingers lingered near the mark denoting her village. Silence. Months of it. His letters unanswered, inquiries met with vague non-replies, a premonition, cold and sharp, twisted in his gut. Still mooning over your maps, Mateo. The sharp voice belonged to his elder brother, Carlos, standing framed in the doorway, disapproval etched onto his stern features. Carlos, ever pragmatic, ever rooted in the solid earth of profit and propriety. Father wonders if you intend to join the living today, or merely haunt this office like a ghost obsessed with worthless parchment. Mateo flinched, pushing the map aside. I am merely reviewing potential trade routes, Carlos. A feeble lie, easily pierced. Trade routes that lead conveniently to a certain fishing village. Carlos stepped further into the room, his shadow falling over the desk. Mateo, this infatuation has gone on long enough. You waste away. You neglect your duties. For what, a peasant girl you met once? Have you forgotten who you are? An Alvarez of Seville, there are advantageous matches to be considered, responsibilities. Mateo's head throbbed. Advantageous matches. Responsibilities. The words were meaningless pebbles against the tidal wave of his longing and fear for Isabella. You don't understand, Mateo whispered, turning away. There is nothing to understand, Carlos retorted, his voice hardening. Only a foolish boy chasing a dream that jeopardizes this family's name. Pull yourself together before father decides to intervene more forcefully. Carlos's footsteps receded, leaving Mateo in the suffocating silence, the scent of oranges suddenly cloying, unbearable. He buried his face in his hands, the image of Isabella's smile, bright, free, alive, a torment. Where was she? What had happened? The silence wasn't just absence, it felt like a void, a dark space where anything terrible could have taken root. Just as despair threatened to engulf him completely, a commotion arose from the main entrance downstairs. Raised voices, the scrape of boots on stone. Mateo stiffened. Unscheduled visitors were rare. He heard the house steward's placating tones, then a rougher voice, insistent. Curiosity, or perhaps a desperate sliver of hope, pulled him from the office. He reached the upper gallery overlooking the entrance hall just as the steward was trying to usher out a ragged, sunburnt man clutching a small, crumpled packet. Cannot simply demand entry, my good man. State your business, or... My business is with Mateo Alvarez, the man insisted, his eyes scanning the upper level. He spotted Mateo. Senor Alvarez, this is for you, from the coast, from Elena Moreno. Elena, Isabella's younger sister. Mateo's heart leaped, then plummeted. He descended the stairs swiftly, ignoring the steward's protests. Give it to me. The man thrust the packet into Mateo's hand. It was thin, worn, sealed crudely with wax. His fingers trembled as he broke the seal. Inside, a single sheet of cheap paper, folded tight. Elena's handwriting, rushed and tear-blotted, spilled across the page. Mateo, it began, forgive this intrusion. Our father, he is gone, taken by the fever, the debts. They were too great. Don Alvaro de Silva. He holds the papers now. He came for Isabella, said it was her obligation. Mateo, he looked at her strangely. She tried to run the night before they came, but they caught her near the cliffs. They took her by force to his hacienda. Guarded. I fear for her. He is a cruel man. If there is anything you can do. The words blurred. Don Alvaro de Silva. A name whispered with fear along the coast, a wealthy landowner known for his ruthlessness and his walled, isolated estate. Taken by force, tried to run, guarded. The cold dread coalesced into icy certainty. Isabella was a prisoner. His lovesickness, the debilitating melancholy, vanished, burned away by a surge of white-hot fury and terror. He looked up, his eyes locking with Carlos, who had emerged to witness the scene, his face a mask of consternation. "I am leaving," Mateo stated, his voice dangerously calm. "Where are you going?" Carlos demanded. "To bring her back." Carlos grabbed his arm as Mateo turned towards the stairs. "You cannot simply ride off to challenge a man like De Silva. He has influence, power. Think of the scandal. Think of this family." Mateo wrenched his arm free, his gaze flinty. "The only thing I am thinking of is Isabella. He took her. I will get her back." He ignored Carlos's sputtering protests, the steward's alarmed face. He strode to his small room, his mind racing. Funds, he needed funds. His personal allowance was meagre. He looked around the room, his eyes falling on a rolled-up chart in the corner, a rare, hand-illuminated porcelain map of the Mediterranean, a gift from his cartographer uncle, his most prized possession. Without hesitation, he snatched it up. It would fetch a good price, enough for the journey, enough perhaps to hire help if needed. He packed sparingly. A change of clothes, his sturdiest boots, a small knife. Pushing past a stunned Carlos in the hallway, he descended to the stables. He saddled his horse, a sturdy Andalusian mare, his movements economical and precise. The lovesick lethargy was gone, replaced by a terrifying clarity of purpose. As he led the horse out into the sun-drenched courtyard, Carlos made one last appeal. "Mateo, por favor! Reconsider, this could ruin us all." Mateo swung himself into the saddle. He looked down at his brother, his face grim. "If I don't go, I am already ruined." He spurred the horse, the clatter of hooves on the cobblestones echoing his departure. He didn't look back at the grand house, the life he was leaving behind. Seville, with its stifling expectations and gilded cage, faded behind him as he rode south, the image of Isabella, captive, endangered, burning in his mind, eclipsing everything else. The journey was brutal. The Andalusian sun beat down mercilessly. He sold the precious map in Jerez, haggling fiercely, the transaction leaving a bitter taste, but filling his purse. He pushed himself and his horse relentlessly, sleeping rough, eating little, fueled by a desperate urgency. Dust coated him, exhaustion gnawed at his bones, but the thought of Isabella propelled him onward. Days later, gaunt and weary, he rode into the small fishing village near Cadiz. It felt different from his memories. The vibrant energy he recalled from that summer was muted, replaced by an air of quiet hardship and fear. The houses huddled together against the persistent sea wind. Nets lay drying on the sand, but the usual bustle was absent. He dismounted, his legs stiff, and scanned the familiar cluster of whitewashed walls. He found the Moreno cottage easily, its small garden neglected, a shutter hanging loose. He knocked, his heart pounding. The door creaked open, and Elena stood there. She was thinner, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and terror when she recognized him. "Mateo, you came?" Tears welled instantly. He stepped inside the small, dark room, the air thick with the lingering scent of dried fish and sorrow. "Elena, your letter." She nodded, clasping her hands tightly. "He took her, Mateo. Don Alvaro. After Papa died, the debt collector showed us the papers. Alvaro bought the debt. He said Isabella was part of the settlement." Her voice broke. She knew something was wrong. The way he looked at her when he came before, possessive. The night before his men arrived, she tried to run away. Packed a small bag intended to head towards Jerez, maybe find work, but his overseer caught her down by the cliffs, dragged her back. The next day they came with guards. She fought them, Mateo, but... Elena sobbed quietly. "They took her to his hacienda, up the coast. It's like a fortress. No one goes near there without reason." She pressed something small and cool into his hand. He looked down. A single, pearly seashell, worn smooth by the waves, the one he'd found with Isabella on the beach that perfect summer day. He closed his fist around it, the fragile curve a tangible link to the girl he had to save. "He keeps her closely watched," Elena whispered, wiping her eyes, "especially after she tried to escape. They say he desires her, not just for work." The confirmation of Alvaro's predatory interest sent another wave of cold fury through Mateo. Isabella wasn't just captive labor, she was a target. Has anyone tried to help? The authorities? Matteo asked, though he already suspected the answer. Elena shook her head despairingly. Who would dare? The corregidor in Huelva owes Don Alvaro favours. The local priest tells us to pray for Isabella's soul and accept God's will. Alvaro owns half the land here, holds everyone under his thumb. We are powerless. Powerless. The word hung heavy in the small cottage. Matteo felt a surge of defiance. He wouldn't be powerless. He spent a day resting, gathering his strength, Elena sharing what little food she had. He tried to formulate a plan, but the hacienda's reputation, its isolation, its guards, loomed large. A direct approach was suicide. Appealing to authority was useless. He needed information, perhaps transportation, someone who knew the coast, someone unafraid of Don Alvaro. He needed someone from the shadows. His thoughts turned to the rough port towns along the coast, places where smugglers, mercenaries, and desperate men plied their trades. Huelva, perhaps, or Palos. He thanked Elena, promising he would find a way, his hand tightening on the seashell in his pocket. He rowed towards Huelva, the resolve hardening within him. He haunted the dockside taverns, noisy, smoke-filled dens smelling of stale wine, sweat, and the sea. He listened to the coarse talk of sailors, fishermen, and men whose allegiances were clearly flexible. He asked discreet questions, mentioning Don Alvaro's estate, gauging reactions. Most men crossed themselves or fell silent. Alvaro's reach was long. Finally, in a particularly disreputable establishment near the salt marshes, a one-eyed tavern keeper jerked his chin towards a man nursing cheap brandy alone in a dark corner. "Ricardo," the keeper muttered, "knows the coast better than the gulls, fears neither God nor Don Alvaro, but his help has a price." Matteo approached the man. Ricardo looked up, his single eye narrowed, assessing Matteo's worn but decent clothes, the desperation clinging to him. He was grizzled, weathered, cynicism etched deep around his eye and mouth. "What do you want, city boy?" Ricardo's voice was raspy, like stones grinding together. Matteo explained, keeping his voice low, outlining Isabella's capture, the hacienda's location, his need for reconnaissance, possibly passage. Ricardo listened impassively, swirling the brandy in his cup. When Matteo finished, Ricardo let out a short, harsh laugh. "Love bah! Risk my neck against Alvaro de Silva for some lovesick fool chasing a skirt? You're madder than you look." He drained his cup. "Get out." Matteo didn't move. He pulled out his dwindling purse, spilling the coins onto the sticky table. It wasn't much, but it was nearly all he had left. Then, on impulse, he opened his hand, revealing the seashell. "Her name is Isabella Moreno. She tried to escape him once already. He holds her prisoner. I will get her back, with or without your help. But I need to see the place, know what I'm facing." Ricardo stared at the coins, then his gaze flickered to the seashell, then back to Matteo's face. He saw the exhaustion, the grime, but also the unwavering intensity in Matteo's eyes. Perhaps it was the mention of the failed escape, a spark of defiance he grudgingly respected. Or perhaps just the glint of the coins. He grunted. "Reconnaissance only. Double the price for passage if it comes to that. And if we're caught, I don't know you." Matteo nodded curtly. Agreed. That night, under a sliver of moon, Ricardo's small, swift fishing boat slipped along the coast. The sea was calm, the air cool. They anchored in a shadowed cove, screened by rocks, a short distance from Don Alvaro's property. The hacienda loomed on a low cliff overlooking the sea, a dark, sprawling silhouette against the starlit sky. High walls, few windows facing the water, the faint glimmer of lamplight within. Matteo scanned the perimeter through Ricardo's spyglass. Guards patrolled the walls, their shapes moving intermittently. It was indeed a fortress. Then his breath caught. In a small, high window, briefly illuminated as someone moved inside, he saw her. Isabella. Just a glimpse. Her profile, bent over some task, her hair pulled back severely. She looked pale, thinner, trapped. Seeing her, even for that fleeting moment, solidified his resolve into something unbreakable. The lovesickness transformed entirely, no longer a passive ache but a burning engine driving him forward. He would free her. "Well guarded," Ricardo muttered beside him, lowering his own spyglass. "Alvaro doesn't like surprises or losing his property." Property. The word made Matteo's blood run cold. "How can anyone get in?" Ricardo shrugged. "Not easily, not without an army, or—" He paused, scratching his grizzled chin. "Or without an invitation." Matteo looked at him sharply. "Alvaro's hosting a feast in 3 days' time," Ricardo continued, spitting into the water. Celebrating some saint's day, or maybe just showing off for some visiting official from Seville. Place will be crawling with guests, extra servants, deliveries, more chaos, more chances for things to go unnoticed or wrong. A feast, an opportunity. Risky, bordering on insane, but perhaps the only one he'd get. There's a storm predicted too, Ricardo added casually, coming in from the west. Could make things interesting. Mateo's mind seized on the possibility. Chaos, distraction, storm cover. He looked towards the hacienda again, towards that small, high window. He had to try. He spent the next 2 days hidden in the coastal scrub near the cove where Ricardo occasionally anchored, observing the hacienda from afar. He watched the routines, the changing of the guards, the deliveries arriving in preparation for the feast. Desperation gnawed at him. He needed to let Isabella know he was here, that help was coming, to give her hope, perhaps even learn something useful. He bribed a young boy delivering fish to the hacienda kitchen, pressing a coin and a tightly folded note into his hand, instructing him to slip it to a servant girl named Isabella Moreno if he saw her. The note was simple. "I am here, be ready, feast night storm." It was a desperate gamble. The boy might be caught, the note intercepted, alerting Alvaro. But the thought of Isabella suffering alone, perhaps losing hope after her failed escape, spurred him on. He could only pray it reached her. He met Ricardo again on the eve of the feast. "The plan?" Ricardo asked gruffly. Mateo outlined his desperate idea, use the feast's confusion and the predicted storm to infiltrate, find Isabella, and escape back to the coast where Ricardo would wait with the boat. Ricardo listened, his one eye expressionless. "Madness," he repeated, but there was a grudging curiosity in his tone. "Costs double, like I said, and you pay half now." Mateo handed over the coins. Ricardo nodded slowly. "Feast starts after sunset. Storm should hit hardest near midnight. Be ready." The night of the feast arrived, thick with tension and the heavy, humid air that precedes a major storm. From his hiding place, Mateo watched the hacienda blaze with light. Carriages arrived, depositing richly dressed guests. Music drifted faintly on the rising wind. Clouds gathered, obscuring the moon and stars. The air crackled with anticipation, both festive and meteorological. As darkness deepened and the wind began to howl, Mateo met Ricardo at the appointed spot near a less guarded section of the wall, partially overgrown with vines. "Ready, city boy," Ricardo muttered, checking the coil of rope he carried. Mateo nodded, his heart hammering against his ribs. He clutched the seashell in his pocket, its smoothness a small anchor in the storm of his fear and resolve. "Create a diversion," Mateo instructed. "Something noticeable away from this side. 10 minutes after I go over." Ricardo grunted. "A small fire in the stables should cause enough panic. Don't get killed." With surprising agility, Ricardo secured the grappling hook high on the wall. Mateo took a deep breath, gripped the rough rope, and began to climb. The wind tore at him, threatening to rip him from his precarious hold. Below, Ricardo melted back into the shadows. Reaching the top, Mateo dropped silently into the darkness of the estate grounds. He oriented himself, heading towards the main house, keeping to the shadows of manicured hedges now thrashing wildly in the wind. Distantly, he heard a shout, then another, the diversion. Flames suddenly leaped up from the direction of the stables, casting flickering orange light against the churning clouds. Shouts of alarm, running footsteps, perfect chaos. Rain began to fall, thick, heavy drops quickly turning into a torrential downpour. Using the confusion, Mateo slipped through a service entrance left ajar by frantic servants. The inside of the house was a cacophony of music, laughter, shouting, and the rising roar of the storm. He navigated corridors filled with rushing servants and tipsy guests, his rough clothes hopefully blending in with the general mayhem. He needed to find Isabella's quarters. Elena had described the approximate location, a small room in the servants' wing, likely kept locked. He reached the quieter servants' wing, the storm muffling sounds. He found the corridor Elena had described. Most doors were closed. He tried one, locked, another. Then a small, sturdy door at the end of the hall. He listened intently. A faint sound from within, or just the wind? He tried the handle. Locked. He drew the knife he carried, preparing to force the lock, when he noticed something. A small dried flower, a sea lavender, tucked into the doorframe. A sign? Had his note reached her? Was this her signal? Hope surged. He worked quickly, expertly jimmying the crude lock with his knife. The mechanism clicked open. He pushed the door inward. Isabella stood there, silhouetted against the meagre light from a small, barred window. She was pale, yes, thinner, her dress coarse servant's garb, but her eyes burned with a fierce, desperate light. She held a heavy iron candlestick, poised to strike. Recognition dawned instantly. "Matteo?" she breathed, the candlestick lowering slightly. "Isabella," he whispered, stepping inside and quickly closing the door. For a moment they just stared, the storm raging outside, a storm mirrored in their tumultuous emotions. He saw the marks of hardship on her, the fear in her eyes, but also an unbroken core of strength that mirrored the girl he remembered. She saw the gauntness of his face, the frantic intensity, the love that had driven him here. He reached for her, but she put a finger to her lips, her eyes darting towards the door. "They watch me closely," she whispered, her voice raspy from disuse or fear. "Especially after I tried before." She gestured towards the window. "The bars are weaker on this side. I noticed when they put them in after, knowledge gained from her failed escape. She hadn't just waited, she had observed, planned. We have to go. Now," Matteo urged. "Ricardo is waiting with a boat." Suddenly, heavy footsteps pounded down the corridor, shouting, "Check all the rooms, the master wants her found." They were discovered, or suspected. No time. "The window," Isabella urged, already pushing against the bars. Matteo joined her. The iron groaned, rusted from the sea air. Together, straining, they managed to bend one bar just enough to squeeze through. Matteo scrambled out first into the lashing rain and darkness, landing heavily on the muddy ground below. He turned, reaching up to help Isabella. She slid through, landing beside him, agile despite her ordeal. "This way," she whispered, pulling him towards a less illuminated part of the grounds. "There's a path the guards don't use often. I saw it." She was taking charge, her knowledge vital. They ran hand in hand through the wind-whipped gardens, the rain plastering their clothes to their skin, mud sucking at their boots. Behind them, lights bobbed, shouts grew louder. An alarm bell began to clang, its frantic rhythm swallowed by the storm. They burst through a hedge and found themselves near the cliff-edge path leading down to the coast. Below, the sea churned, white foam exploding against the rocks. Suddenly, a figure loomed before them. Don Alvaro's head guard, a burly man with a cruel face, lantern held high. "Going somewhere, little birds?" he sneered, drawing a heavy cudgel. Matteo shoved Isabella behind him, raising his small knife. It looked pitiful against the guard's weapon. But before the guard could advance, Isabella darted forward, scooping up a handful of wet mud and gravel, flinging it directly into the man's face. He roared, momentarily blinded, stumbling back. Matteo seized the chance, lunging forward, not with the knife, but with his shoulder, hitting the man low and hard. The guard lost his footing on the slick ground and tumbled sideways with a cry, his lantern extinguishing as he rolled down a short embankment. They didn't wait to see more. They scrambled down the treacherous cliff path, rocks slick with rain, the wind threatening to tear them from the narrow track. Below, a faint light flickered near the cove. Ricardo. They reached the churning water's edge just as pursuing guards appeared at the top of the path, shouting, their lanterns swinging wildly. "Ricardo!" Matteo yelled over the storm's roar. The small boat surged forward on a wave, Ricardo skillfully maneuvering it closer. "Get in! Now!" They waded into the violent surf, waves crashing over them. Matteo practically threw Isabella into the rocking boat before hauling himself over the side, collapsing onto the wet boards. Ricardo pushed off hard, rowing with powerful strokes against the undertow. A shot rang out from the cliff top, the sound sharp even above the wind, but the bullet went wide, lost in the spray and darkness. They were moving out, away from the shore, swallowed by the raging sea and the night. The night at sea was a terrifying ordeal. Ricardo battled the storm with grim determination, the small boat tossed mercilessly by mountainous waves. Matteo held Isabella close, shielding her from the worst of the spray, whispering reassurances he barely felt himself. She clung to him, trembling not just from cold but from the violent release of months of pent-up fear and despair. They spoke little, the roar of the wind and sea drowning out all else, their shared survival a bond stronger than words. As dawn broke, the storm began to subside, leaving behind a bruised grey sky and a heaving, exhausted sea. Ahead, the jagged outline of a different stretch of coast emerged through the mist. Ricardo steered them towards a hidden cove, inaccessible from land, its small beach sheltered by steep cliffs. "This is as far as I go," he announced, his voice raw with fatigue. "From here, you're on your own. Keep inland. Avoid the villages for a while." Mateo pressed the last of his coins into the smuggler's hand. Ricardo counted it quickly, nodded once. "Vaya con Dios," he muttered, a phrase that sounded almost like a blessing, or perhaps just a dismissal. He pushed the boat back out into the swell and was soon lost in the grey morning mist. Mateo helped Isabella onto the sand. They stumbled a few steps, then collapsed onto the damp beach, utterly spent. For a long moment they simply lay there, the rhythmic sigh of the receding waves washing over them, the reality of their escape slowly sinking in. Safe, free, together. Mateo turned, looking at Isabella. Her hair was matted with salt, her face streaked with grime, her clothes torn, but her eyes, meeting his, held a dawning light. He reached out, gently brushing a stray strand of hair from her cheek. The debilitating weight that had crushed him for months, the lovesickness that had hollowed him out, lifted completely, replaced by an overwhelming wave of relief, tenderness, and fierce, protective love. He was no longer the haunted scholar. He was the man who had crossed hell to find her. Isabella leaned into his touch, tears finally spilling, not of fear this time, but of catharsis. I thought I would never see you again, Mateo," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "After I tried to run, he was so cruel. He said no one would ever come for me, that I belonged to him." "You belong to no one but yourself, Isabella," Mateo said fiercely, pulling her into a tight embrace. "Never him." They held each other, drawing strength from the contact, the shared warmth warding off the morning chill. Slowly, haltingly at first, they shared their stories. Her terrifying captivity, the constant vigilance, the flicker of hope when his desperate note arrived, the fear during the escape, his consuming lovesickness, the confrontation with his family, the arduous journey, the desperate gamble with Ricardo. As they spoke, the scars of their ordeal remained, but the wounds began to close. Isabella's resilience shone through the trauma, her spirit, though tested, unbroken. Mateo saw the depth of her courage, realizing she had been fighting her own battle long before he arrived. "We cannot go back, Mateo," Isabella said softly, looking around the desolate cove,